Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery, and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019, who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs, because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week, found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. and at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges, a man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase delivered safely could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details, and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room-safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, west wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. "Northgate, lights out, he's still here." Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 M asterisk, was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 M asterisk, 2 men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, But at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. 2 guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The stories. A final call was traced near that bridge. Late in the evening of October 5th, 2016, a storm rolled through a quiet stretch of countryside. Wind battered the old bridge over Hollow Creek, shaking the steel rails and scattering leaves across the asphalt. Around 10:32 p.m., dispatch logs show a brief, incomplete 911 call pinged off the nearest tower. The caller's voice was male, panicked, and cut off mid-sentence. Investigators later marked the audio as simply unresolved. The man behind that call was named Leon Price, 43, a long-haul truck mechanic from a nearby industrial town. He'd spent the day finishing a repair job for a delivery company, planning to drive home to his wife in time to watch a recorded game. According to coworkers, Leon left the shop around 9:40, saying he wanted to check something quick before heading home. That something was never explained. By morning, Leon's truck was found parked near the old bridge, headlights off, and driver's door locked. His phone sat on the passenger seat, the last number dialed being emergency services. The call duration? 12 seconds. No sign of a struggle. Just the smell of damp metal and mud, and a faint drag mark leading toward the railing. Search teams spent 3 days combing the area. Divers worked the shallow creek, drones scanned the woods. Nothing. Local papers speculated everything from suicide to abduction, but investigators leaned toward an accident. Maybe he'd slipped trying to inspect something under the bridge. Yet the coroner never received a body, and the case sat open as missing, presumed dead. His number mens in spix. Years later, in 2021, a city engineer named Rachel Kearns was reviewing archived bridge inspection photos for a maintenance report. In one image, taken 2 days before Leon's disappearance, a reflection caught her attention. The photo showed the lower truss beam standard shot, but in the corner, faintly lit by a maintenance flashlight, there was a silhouette of a man crouching. The timestamp placed it around dusk on October 3rd, 2 days before Leon vanished. The engineer who'd taken the photo, retired since, confirmed no one else was scheduled to be on site. Rachel forwarded the image to the county sheriff's office, and they reopened the file. Investigators re-examined Leon's work records, tracing his calls and texts from that week. One stood out. A message to a contact labeled BR sent the afternoon of October 5th. It read, *, I found it, meeting at the bridge tonight. *, the number was prepaid, never registered, and disconnected within 48 hours. A detail in the message puzzled detectives. Leon wasn't known for secrecy. His wife, Dana, told them he'd been bothered for months by something from an old job, saying he'd done work he wasn't proud of for a client that refused to pay. Dana assumed it was a parts dispute, but when she mentioned a box Leon kept locked in his garage, the investigation shifted. Inside the box, police found a spiral notebook filled with maintenance records dating back to 2009, all logged under a defunct company name, Midstate Transport. Midstate had folded after a fatal trucking accident that same year, a crash investigators blamed on faulty brake lines. In a note scrawled at the back of Leon's notebook, he'd written, asterisk, proof they used counterfeit parts. Need photo evidence. Asterisk. The handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if written in haste. Detectives contacted the National Highway Safety Archive, which confirmed that a whistleblower had anonymously submitted similar claims in 2009, alleging that Midstate falsified inspection reports. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. The archived whistleblower email was traced back to a generic account created under the name LP. That bridge where Leon's final call was traced? It connected two counties where Midstate operated their delivery routes. According to old GPS logs, the crash that ended the company happened less than a mile from the same spot. Investigators brought in a retired dispatcher, Marvin Blake, who'd worked the radio the night of Leon's disappearance. He remembered something odd. Just after the 911 call ended, the system registered another incoming line static, then silence. It was like someone else tried calling from the same tower seconds later, he said. But the system flagged it as unregistered equipment, like a test signal. The telecom technician reviewing archive data found that the second call's source ID matched an obsolete analog handset, one last sold around 2010. Its signal strength placed it not on the bridge, but 30 yards downstream, near a maintenance access path. Detectives returned to the site. Flood levels had receded since 2016, revealing a rusted toolbox half buried in silt beneath the bridge. Inside were several brake components, a corroded camera memory card, and a name tag, price L. The photos recovered from the card showed close-ups of serial numbers on parts stamped with counterfeit manufacturer codes, exact matches to those listed in the old Midstate case file. Forensic analysts reconstructed the final minutes of Leon's life through phone tower data and ambient audio from the recovered memory card. The recording suggested he'd been documenting the parts, likely intending to turn them in as evidence. Rain intensified, wind roared, and a loud metallic creak echoed the sound consistent with a vehicle crossing the bridge above him. Seconds later came a splash and muffled crash. The last image on the card showed Leon's flashlight beam turned toward the creek bank, and in the background, a dark SUV partially visible through the guardrails. Authorities attempted to trace any vehicles on that bridge during the window of time. Traffic cameras from the nearby highway ramp were down that night due to the storm, but one motion-activated wildlife camera a mile away captured taillights heading east around 10:35. The model matched an SUV owned by a former Midstate executive, Brent Rowan. When questioned, Rowan denied being anywhere near the area, stating he'd sold that vehicle years prior. Records later showed the SUV's title transfer occurred 2 months after Leon's disappearance. With no physical remains and no eyewitnesses, the district attorney declined prosecution. The case was again marked unresolved. Still, among investigators, the consensus hardened that Leon Price had gone back to finish what he'd started years earlier to expose falsified safety records that cost lives. He'd arranged to meet someone that night, someone who realized too late what evidence he carried. In early 2022, bridge maintenance crews discovered a piece of phone casing embedded in the concrete ledge beneath the guardrail. Lab tests confirmed it matched Leon's model and contained trace data from his final call. The last GPS ping aligned within 3 feet of where the toolbox was found. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man burdened by guilt tried to make something right. He gathered proof of wrongdoing, arranged a meeting, and never came back. The evidence he left behind, notes, photos, the final call, spoke louder than any statement could. Dana Price still visits the site once a year. Locals say she leaves a small brass key on the railing. Investigators believe it's the key from Leon's garage lockbox, the one he'd used to hide the notebook that reopened everything. The bridge stands quiet now, repaved and monitored by new cameras. Every so often, a maintenance crew reports interference on their radios when crossing after dark. a faint echo that clips mid-word 12 seconds long, always the same. Officially, the file reads, "Case closed, pending further evidence." Unofficially, among those who worked it, the belief endures that Leon Price's final call wasn't a cry for help, but a handover. A man trying, in his last breath, to trace the truth back to where it first broke. The stories. Dispatcher, who redialed a night number years later. The call that woke the overnight desk never finished cleanly, and the number that hung up stayed burned into memory. The report marked it as an incomplete welfare check request, and the audio ended right after a sharp breath. Leora Vance worked nights at a regional communications center, 36, steady voice, quick notes, routine coffee. She covered a patchwork of small towns around a river, and her goal that night was simple and ordinary. She wanted to make it through the shift with clean logs, then drive home before sunrise. At 2:43, the line flashed unknown number, and a woman whispered that somebody was on the porch. The voice cracked like cold glass, and static clipped the rest. So Leora asked the normal questions. The call died mid-sentence, and the return attempt fed a busy tone that rolled like a slow alarm. Protocol said, log it, dispatch a unit, and move forward with the map. She sent 2 cars across county lines, and she wrote porch contact unknown female, possible prowler, audio cutout. The officers found a silent street and a door light, and the porch camera showed only a moth. The address did not match the call trace, which often happened with rural switches. The closest relevant record was a break-in from 1998, and the same street used to be named differently on paper maps. The officers cleared without contact, and Leora filed it under incomplete with a notation on poor signal. She replayed the clip during the quiet hour before dawn, and she heard a faint tone behind the voice. She had a habit of catching tiny sounds people missed, and she logged them like breadcrumbs for later check. The tone matched the alert from older medical pendants, according to an equipment chart in her drawer. 2 days later, the number could not be connected, and the carrier reported a recycled pool of lines. A supervisor closed the incident, as resolved by patrol presence, and life returned to the ordinary rhythm of alarms and traffic. Leora drove home through thin drizzle and told herself to let the record settle. Years slid by with new software and different chairs, and Leora moved into training and quality checks. She taught new dispatchers to separate panic from facts and to trust logs more than late-night adrenaline. She kept a notebook of unresolved lines, a quiet ledger of what the radio called ghosts. In 2005, a county audit required purging old tapes, and Leora requested the call as a training sample. She argued that the tape showed how to verify address data when signals bounced, and the review board agreed to preserve it. She placed the audio in a folder for classroom use, then forgot it for a while. In 2017, the center switched to digital recording with automatic transcription for flagged words. The legacy folder ported into the new system, and the software saw porch and pendant, then tagged it for quality review. Leora listened again and heard the same faint tone, which still felt wrong and unfinished. She noticed a rhythm behind the static, and it repeated every 6 seconds with small variants. A trainee suggested a smoke detector chirp, but the pattern felt too mechanical for a battery warning. Leora wrote a new note, and she marked it as likely device signal not from residents. A retired technician stopped by for coffee and heard the clip through an open speaker. He said the beeping sounded like a hallway alarm from a care facility, and the pitch matched certain wall units. He gave a rough model name from years earlier, and he shrugged in that cautious way field techs learn. Witness statements in older town council minutes mentioned a small facility that closed in 2006. The building sat at the edge of a service road near the river, and the license lapsed after staff shortages. The address never showed in the dispatch mapping tool, which favored current businesses and active residences. Leora searched archived calls around that road and found short bursts from unknown lines that year. Each clip cut off before a name, and the patrol responses found nothing but chain doors and dust. A maintenance crew had watched the property for a bank, according to one officer report from spring. She pulled tax records from the county site and found a change of ownership in 2007. The building title shifted to a holding company, which often meant redevelopment, which never came. A satellite photo showed a roof with patched squares and a light pole that leaned toward the access lane. The night number from the porch call mapped to a carrier block once used inside institutions. A policy note in an old binder described internal extensions that could overflow to outbound lines when certain failsafes trip. It was not proof, but it lined up with what the technician had described over coffee. She visited the records room on her lunch and requested dispatch logs for that road after 2006. The clerk pulled a slim folder with dust, and the sheets listed trespass checks requested by neighbors. No violent incidents were recorded, and most notes referenced animals and teens daring each other. A faded memo said interior power was cut to code years ago, and alarms were disconnected with a certificate. The memo was initialed by a contractor who later moved out of state, according to a local paperclip. The paper mentioned a minor zoning fight over repurposing, which stalled and faded. A rumor in a neighborhood forum referenced late-night lights near the loading door, reportedly seen by a delivery driver. The driver claimed to hear a tone like a distant truck backup, and then nothing after he blinked his high beams. The forum thread ended with jokes, and the administrator locked it after a week. Leora requested permission to run a courtesy check by phone on the legacy carrier block. She wrote that the new system showed occasional pings from inactive numbers, and she wanted to verify with the provider. The provider sent a bland letter that said non-billable pings could reflect maintenance checks, which proved little. She let it go again until 2021, when a cold storm knocked power around much of the valley. The center fielded hundreds of calls for downed lines and trees, and unknown numbers flooded the switch when cell towers failed. The old number flashed across a test screen, and a note in red tagged it as historic. It hit her in the middle of managing a pile of alarms, and she felt the odd gravity of unfinished work. Her trainee, a quiet analyst named Matteo Greer, saw her stare and asked what history followed that line. She explained the porch call, the tone, the closed facility, and the recurring pings during outages. He suggested a careful redial during low traffic hours, which fit policy when no private party would be disturbed. The number technically did not belong to a person, and the facility was listed as vacant in tax files. The watch commander noted no risk and approved a controlled test with recording flagged as training. At 3:10 the next night, Leora sat with Matteo in a side room and pressed redial on a clean console. The ring returned at a low volume, and a relay clicked before a voice picked up with a machine crawl. The voice said, "Reception desk. Please hold." The line stayed open with air and faint humming. Leora spoke carefully, and she used the generic script for a wellness verification at an inactive site. The line did not respond like normal interactive voice response, and the hum rose, then settled like heating vents. Matteo pointed to the waveform on the screen, and he traced a stair step that pulsed in threes. She said the center needed to verify status for a safety audit, and could a staff member confirm the building as empty. The voice returned with a single word, and it sounded like census, which made no sense for a desk. The hum changed to a thinner tone, and something clicked like a phone being set down. They stayed quiet, and a tiny echo carried an off-room sound that resembled elevator chimes. The building never had an elevator, according to the old permit in the zoning files, which listed 2 floors only. The chime could have been something else, or a bleed from another source through a carrier trunk. The call lasted 2 minutes, and then a hard click ended it with no final acknowledgement or goodbye. Leora logged every detail with exact time and the conditions of the room, plus the fact that a second console witnessed. She wrote that the voice felt recorded, but not like a standard system recording from that era. A next step followed policy, which said request a daytime site check with property access if possible. The sheriff office called the management company, which reported that the interior phones were long removed with certification. A maintenance vendor met deputies at noon, and the group entered through a side door with a stubborn hinge. They found clean air, paint flakes, and a smell like dry paper after long storage. No phones sat on desks, and no wiring hung from ceilings beyond bundled tubes cut and capped. A panel in the back room had a line of dead indicators, and a label from 2006 named the contractor. A back storage closet held a metal cabinet for telecom terminations, and inside a single light glowed green. The maintenance vendor said the light probably fed from a battery pack, which should have died many years earlier. He pulled the pack, and the light stayed green, which made him raise his eyebrows without a word. They traced the last live wire through conduit to a junction box near the loading door by the ramp. The box led to an old underground line that likely connected to a central office by the highway. The vendor said a ghost loop could be holding a stub signal, which might ring when jolted by storms. The explanation fit enough to calm nerves, and it gave the watch commander a line to give any curious council member. Leora filed the daytime result and waited for the routine to end, but her notebook felt heavier than before. She wanted something cleaner, a line that tied the porch call to a person. She checked archived calls for names near the facility in late 2005, and a surname appeared twice. The name belonged to a kitchen worker who reportedly stayed late to clean and who left town soon after closure. A short article from a community paper mentioned a farewell potluck in a church hall. A social post from years later showed a small photo of a medal on a refrigerator and a caption about nights that never end. The account had poor privacy settings, and it linked to a page for a caretaker group that offered mutual aid. The group had a public list of contacts, and one number matched the surname. She called during the afternoon from a staff phone and explained she was a dispatcher reviewing a historic alarm. The woman who answered identified herself as the former cook, and she said the night phones were a mess back then. She remembered plugging a line into a wall to ask for help during a snow night, then hanging up fast. The year matched the period before closure, and the memory included a porch light that never switched off correctly. The cook said a hallway alarm sometimes tripped when wind hit the wheelchairs stacked near an exit door. She said a pendant kept calling the desk after the resident moved, and staff joked about it. Leora asked if anyone had used an emergency night number taped under a desk, and the woman hesitated, then said maybe. She said an old laminated card listed a direct outside line for after hours when the main switch froze. She added that the card got lost during a water leak, and the sticker glue ruined 2 drawers. The detail matched a photo in the zoning files that showed bubbled plywood under a window near the desk. The water issue provided another path for odd faults, which could keep a line limping and ring when power fluctuated. The cook promised to look through an old box for any scraps, and she promised nothing more. Days later, an envelope arrived addressed to the center with no return, and inside lay half a laminated card. The text read, "Night number for direct line. Use only if house phones fail." The bottom showed 6 digits with 2 missing. The plastic edge was cracked, and a brown stain cut through the second line. Leora held the fragment near the recording console and felt the story settle into a shape that made sense. The porch call likely came from a staffer trying to poke through a dead switch, and the tone was the hallway alarm. The number carried forward through bureaucratic leftovers, and it rang when the storm hit the loop. She still needed the humane piece. The person whose whisper said someone was on the porch that night. She checked weather records for a cold snap that matched the reported snow night, and the timeline met the audit note. A dispatch log from the same week showed a trespass call at a different address with no contact. The officer who filed that trespass had retired to a nearby town, and he answered his landline on a sunny afternoon. He remembered a night when snow fell like ash and radios kept picking up carrier noise. He also remembered stopping near the old facility entrance, then leaving after seeing only footprints of a stray dog. He did not remember any porch lights, but he said the small homes nearby sometimes used helper bulbs that never slept. He also said staff from the facility used to walk to a bus stop at 4 in the morning after night shifts. The whisper could have been a staffer leaving alone, worried by a shape on the ramp. The theory fit and did no harm, and it honored the boundary between records and stories. Leora wrote a final entry into the training file, and she summarized the chain of evidence with careful language. She used reportedly, and dispatch logs and witness statements, and she added the laminated card as a scanned appendix. Before she closed it, she redialed the night number 1 last time to satisfy the part of her that wanted symmetry. The line clicked into a dead tone for 3 slow breaths, then released a single chime in silence. She sat still, then pressed stop, and saved the recording with a title that matched her steady heart. She did not post about it, and she did not share more than the classroom frame. The work of nights is often this quiet, a puzzle solved just enough to let people sleep. On her drive home, she watched a porch light fade behind a tree line and let the road carry the rest away. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered, as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ordis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ordis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high-water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small-town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly, steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary. Until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back. Just, it doesn't feel right. Someone was here. The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No, 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle. Only Martin, sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly, a local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, "medic en route." By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 and the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with 2 folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him